Hi everyone. So it's been a few weeks since I've presented you with one of my video lectures. I've been using a few different sources of videos to sort of cover the content over the last couple of weeks. Excuse me, with the nutrient cycles and the biomes. I wanted to give you guys a little bit more of a visual aid for those. I think it was a little bit more effective in using simple animations and videos in order to sort of visualize those processes. And then last week, I was sort of looking for a way for you guys, again, to get sort of a more visual picture of the threats to biodiversity and some of the things that we are particularly concerned about. So in this particular lecture video, what I'm going to do is just give you a really brief and basic overview of our chapters here. And this chapter is called Environmental Conservation, and yet if you, as we kind of go through the notes today, you'll see that it's really more about almost management. So we're almost talking about how we manage different types of environments. So, sorry, as we proceed here, we're going to be talking about two types of ecosystems, and those are ecosystems that are very prevalent here in the United States, but these are also very economically prevalent ecosystems worldwide and globally as well. So we're going to talk about forests and we're going to talk about grasslands. And in a nutshell, the idea here is that we sort of focus on these resources and focusing our conservation efforts here because we tend to have a lot of competing uses for these lands. So leaving forests intact creates habitat for a huge variety of species, especially in tropical rainforests in particular. However, we also know that forests in particular provide a lot of necessary economic services. So in particular, the wood and some of the products that we can grow on these forested lands, so lumber, paper pulp. We can use the land to clear it and graze it and allow livestock to graze on it, and that's what's happening a lot in South America, for example, with the tropical rainforests there. Much of the land that is being cleared is being used for agricultural purposes, so either to grow crops or to raise cattle, for example. Forests also provide necessary what we call ecological services, and we've talked a little bit about these, but these are services that we don't have to pay for, that the environment provides us for free. So forests are a huge combat to climate change, right? They're taking in that excess carbon dioxide that we're putting into the atmosphere, going through the process of photosynthesis and then turning that into actual mass in the tree. We also have controlling water runoff, that the roots hold the soil in place and the soil is able to absorb water. And then of course we have the homes for habitat, or excuse me, the home for wildlife, for example. And people like forests, right? We like to walk through the forests. Forest preserves are very popular here in sort of our area, and it's something that has a lot of recreational value as well. So if we're looking at the types of forests, again, most are tropical forests. So when we were going through our biome discussions and we talked about those temperate and tropical forests, those are here. Here's the tropical forests. Here's the temperate forests. The boreal forests, again, are the ones that are a little bit further north. And what you'll probably notice is that we have the most land types still tied up in the boreal forests and the tropical forests. And that's not by mistake. Temperate forests and subtropical forests tend to be places where the most conversion of land has taken place. So here in the United States, for example, historically before settlers, the eastern half of the United States, so basically just past Illinois and east of here all the way to the coast north and south, was all covered with temperate forests. But then, of course, settlers came in and we did all kinds of things to the land, right? So we dramatically decreased the amount of temperate forests. And then what are they being used for, or what's happening in these forests? Some of them, again, are just being maintained. We're keeping them as preserved forested areas. Some of them get turned into pastures and rangeland. Some of them get turned into crops, and then others have sort of this mixed use value to them. So we talked about how boreal and tropical forests are the most abundant. Again, here's where they're located. They're great big carbon sinks. They suck in a lot of carbon. They're really important. Here's what a tropical forest looks like in Queensland, for example, in Australia. So if you look overall at the amount of area that we have in forested areas. So, and then the change that we've seen, even in just the last sort of 25 years, you can see that in places like North America, we actually have a slight increase in the amount of in our forested areas. So we're doing a good job of replanting, if you will. Whereas in other parts of the world, especially Central and South America, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Asia, you can see that they're losing lots of rainforest. And again, it's because of those different pressures that we see, because of all the valuable products that we find in the forest. So we need wood to build homes, we need wood to make all of our paper and paperboard. So fuel wood accounts for half of global wood consumption. That's just the wood that people need to burn in their homes to heat their homes or to make cooking fires. So it's not just consumer products and things that have value to us as highly developed countries, but it also has a huge value to those slowly developed and underdeveloped countries where they actually need that wood for a subsistence basis just to heat their homes and survive. I'm not going to talk too much about monoculture forestry, but one of the reasons why here in the United States the amount of forested land we have is actually slightly increasing is because of this. We can plant timber farms. So we can basically plant trees that grow quickly that we can quickly then harvest to make lumber and paper and things like that. So we know that the tropical rainforests are being cleared rapidly. They occupy less than 10% of the whole Earth's surface, but we know that they contain over 2/3 of all biomass. So biomass is if you took all green living things on this planet and you weighed them to see how much they weigh, that's biomass. 2/3 of all of that is located down in those tropical rainforests. And we also know that at least half of all species of plants, animals, and microbes live there. So it's a really important ecosystem, and it's under a lot of pressure. And the pressure mostly is coming from the agricultural side. Again, they are taking the land and they are burning it and clearing it and using it to graze cattle because of the demand and the price for beef globally. So ranchers can make money by doing that, and also then just for farming in and of itself. So lots of things in addition to farming: logging for valuable trees, building roads so that we can take down more trees, but also so that we can have agriculture in there, so we can get into miners and hunters and anybody else who wants to use the forest. And again, small scale agriculture is very, very common. Let's skip on now to, and I'm going to move on to a discussion of grasslands. So that's sort of one of the other sort of large categories of ecosystems that we see in lots of places around the world. In addition to different types of forests, we have all these different types of grasslands. So grasslands are the second most heavily used sort of biome after the forests are. So these are places where we don't get quite enough rain to support a lot of trees, but we have at least enough rain to support a fair amount of what we call herbaceous or grassy plants. That's the idea. So here in Illinois, this is sort of what our state was covered with, top to bottom, grasslands. So we were temperate grasslands. The tall grass prairie sort of was an ecosystem that dominated our state for the most part. Grasslands, more so even than forested lands, are almost frequently converted into agricultural fields to grow food. And the reason is because thousands and thousands of years of these grasses that have grown on this land have created very nutrient-rich soils, and those nutrient-rich soils are perfect for farming. So what we see then is we have grassland disturbance actually is occurring at a faster rate than tropical rainforest disturbance. It's happening at about 3 times the rate does. So again, this is an example of what a short grass prairie would look like. So if you can imagine these plants being even taller, so imagine them coming up to about this point on the fence post here, as far as the eye can see, that would have been what our prairies look like here in Illinois. The further west you go, in through Kansas and Wyoming, and the parts of the Dakotas, you would get into more of the short grass prairies. They get less rain, so therefore they have shorter plants. Just like many things, one of the biggest problems when it comes to our grasslands and keeping our grasslands intact is the problem with animals coming in and overgrazing these lands, and it causes the soil to degrade. When there's no plants to anchor the soil down and to hold the soil down into place, the soil can get blown around very easily. Okay, it's very easy to lose soils, and remember, these are really good soils, and so when we lose them, they're gone. It takes 1,000 years to get that soil back. So what we see is one of the biggest pressures on grasslands happens to be overgrazing. And so most of the public lands here in the United States, which is again a lot of land west of here, so we don't have public lands here in Illinois, but these public open lands, which farmers can get and ranchers can get permits. They pay the government like a permit fee, and the government says you can graze your cattle in all of these lands, and you pay this small permit fee and you're allowed to do that. The problem is that the government is not very good about regulating those permits and about how much these cattle can go through and graze on this land. And what they're doing is they're completely tearing up these grassland ecosystems. And so rather than charging the ranchers more money, which is what they should do to prevent that, they have instead opened land up to even more grazing, and it's causing lots of problems. So there's a few ways that we can kind of tackle this. One is to move them around rather than letting them just graze everywhere. Allow them to graze in sort of small little pockets of land, and then move them on to somewhere else so that the land that you just left can actually sort of regenerate and come back. So restoring those lands is important. So we call it rotational grazing. So you might have a group of animals that's in one patch of land for a period of a week to 10 days, and then we move them to another patch of land, and that way they don't overgraze and they don't completely destroy the land. So the last part of this particular lecture is about the desire and the need to create dedicated areas where we can go out and just be with nature and enjoy nature. And in the United States, that looks like our parks and preserves system. So we have a series of laws in place that enable us to establish both state and federal parks. We can create nature preserves, we can create wildlife sanctuaries, so there's lots of different things that we can do. And the great thing is, or the really nice thing is, globally, worldwide, the amount of area that we are protecting, that we are preventing human use coming in and degrading the land, that's actually increasing. So we see big growth in not just terrestrial land-based ecosystem protection, but especially marine-based ecosystem protection, because as we realize how important marine sanctuaries are in order to keep the health of our oceans, we're doing a little bit more of that as well. So lots of countries have created nature preserves. We see them all over. They don't always have the same, they're not always called necessarily nature preserves. Every country can be different about how they designate that land. Countries can also dictate what you can do in a preserve. So there are some very strict regulations on you can't touch this place, no roads, no people, no nothing. It's there, and let's keep it that way. Whereas other places we build in infrastructure for humans to enjoy. So we might build some outbuildings and a visitor center and some hiking trails and things like that. And then in other countries, you can even have preserves where there's some economic use of the land, like ATVs running through, or you could pay a small fee for different types of resources that you take, for example. So it all kind of depends on the country. But in any case, one of the complaints is that it's wonderful that our national parks and preserves and things are so popular, but it's also there's a downside to that, and the downside to that is that they're getting overly crowded, and too many people in these natural areas that weren't created to contain this many people are causing problems all the same. So I briefly mentioned these marine ecosystems, that we are doing a good job of making more of these, but we could be doing an even better job of making more of these. We need to preserve much more in order to get more marine life included in these protections. So last but not least is, how can we protect nature and also serve the needs of humans, right? Because it's not an either or. It's not we either protect nature or we meet the needs of humans, and those aren't two disparate things. We can do both, but what it requires some creative thinking, and it requires some talking with stakeholders. So this is an idea here where you could have, let's say we're in Southeast Asia, for example, or we're in South America. If we can create a system where the people who live here don't need to necessarily destroy the forest in order to raise food, in order to sustain their own living, what if we could give them another way to make money? So what if we set up a reserve where we don't allow human activity, but then we have and we encourage research and ecotourism to come in, and we very limit how much is there. And of course, ecotourism brings in money, it brings in local dollars. You get the local people involved in that ecotourism, you have them be a part of it. On the outside of that, those people could have their settlements, and then on the outside of that, you could have different uses like farming, for example. So if you sort of think carefully through this, there's a way to protect living things, but to also meet the needs of the local people who need it, rather than come in and say, your land's too valuable, you can't use it, don't do anything. That's not going to work, right? So we have to sort of make that effort. And again, it requires effort. Some places globally are doing a better job than others when it comes to meeting those needs of native and local people. So that's essentially what this slide is talking about as well, making sure that we are not in some way making it impossible for native people to stay on their land, or make them impossible for them to make a living. That does it for this particular lecture. I know this one was kind of brief. Again, just make sure that you understand the uses and the value in those two ecosystems, the forests and the grasslands, because there will be a essay question on that for this next exam.